You so much to the Lincoln County Historical Association and to Old Bristol Historical Society for inviting me to speak to you all and for facilitating this great event. I'm really excited, and I would definitely recommend everyone who is here tonight to see Bob Green speak next week. Bob is a great friend and collaborator, and he is just a fountain of knowledge. So I would absolutely recommend tuning in for that as well. I'm going to start today with some acknowledgments. I'd first really like to thank the Peters family, the Peters and Mink families, and all of their descendants for their generosity and sharing so much information with me, and for, entrusting me to speak about their family's history. There are many people all over Maine and of course the country and even the world that are descended of these families that I'm going to talk about today. And I'm really just very always profoundly moved by their support of my research. I'd also like to acknowledge that I am giving this presentation from Bangor on unceded Penobscot land and acknowledge the importance of the Wabanaki peoples of Maine in this history. So I'm going to start with a general overview of slavery in Maine. It's really important for us to understand this history of both slavery and racism, and then also freedom making by people of African descent and the ways in which they found community and creative forms of resistance to all of these overwhelming forces over the past, several hundred years. Slavery in colonial northern New England was a relatively small institution. The first person, uh, certainly to have been enslaved and lived in Maine, had arrived at least by 1663, when a deed in the southern Maine town of York gave, from Thomas Bolt, gave his son-in-law, quote, a boy named Mingo. By 1715, there were approximately 2,000 enslaved people in the colony of Massachusetts Bay. By 1775, there were approximately 3,500 enslaved people living in Massachusetts, 629 in New Hampshire. In New York, by comparison, there were approximately 15,000 enslaved people listed there. However, that does not mean that slavery was non-existent or milder than in the South. Um, Classic historian Lorenzo Johnston Green, who wrote The Negro in Colonial New England in the 1940s, noted that an enslaver named Nathaniel Kane beat an enslaved woman named Rachel to death in Maine in 1695. Sir William Pepperell, a wealthy merchant and son-in-law of a slave trader who owned a large house in Kittery Point, Maine, purchased 5 captive Africans to be brought from Kittery from Antigua in 1719. In a letter dated June 25th, 1719, Merchant Benjamin Bullard stated, Sir, I received yours by Captain Morris with bills of lading for 5 Negroes and 1 hogshead of rum. One Negro woman marked Y on the left breast died in about 3 weeks after her arrival, in spite of medical aid which I procured. All the rest died at sea. I am sorry for your loss. It may have resulted in deficient clothing so early in the spring. Obviously, the loss that Ballard is lamenting is a financial one, not the human life that had been lost. And this really speaks to the inhumanity of this system, even here in Maine. The enslavement of African descended people in Maine was primarily reserved for the wealthy. Pepperell was said to have sailed down the Piscataqua River on a barge attended by several African captives, a clear sign to all that he had wealth and status. And this worldly connection in what was a very rural and sparsely populated region. Continual resistance against colonization and settlements in Maine by Wabanaki people during the 17th century kept the population small and isolated to the southern and coastal parts of the state. This also served to keep the enslaved population small in comparison to the plantation south, and the growth relatively slow in comparison to the larger population expansion of the region during the 18th century. Yet there was a colonial market for enslaved people in Maine as early as 1650 in the town of York. By a 1754 census, there were approximately 154 enslaved men and women with a roughly 2-to-1 ratio of males to females in the state of Maine, or what would become the state of Maine. Colonial slavery in Maine was small but important socially, as enslaving was reserved primarily for individuals of higher social status and wealth who utilized connections to the Atlantic slave trade via merchant activities in order to support and expand slavery in the region. And you'll see here on the screen a few different pieces of information. I would encourage you, if you're interested in this topic, to look up the work of Patricia Wall, who did a study of enslavement in York County. And it's fascinating and tells this really important story of the colonial period. I also saw my friend Vana Carmona, hi Vana, on the call, and Vana has a really important database that she has created called the Prince Project, which records African Americans in the state of Maine, all across the state, that she's been compiling for years now. So in Maine, what we have in New England, what we have traditionally understood is that what historian of slavery called Ira Berlin called Maine in New England a society with slaves versus a slave society. And what that essentially means is that he didn't believe that enslavement was part and parcel to the way that this New England was constructed. And I would actually argue against that, that slavery is, you know, incredibly important to how the social structure of New England was created and to the financial underpinnings of the growth of New England. We just did not have a plantation economy here. New Englanders, like Pepperell, enslaved people offshore in the Caribbean, in South America, and in other places. They were engaged in the global slave trade. And if you're interested in that topic, you can look me up. I talk a lot about the slave trade as well. You can look me up on YouTube. Notwithstanding the small numbers of enslaved people in New England, African Americans resisted their bondage and oppression. The supposedly benign nature of slavery in colonial northern New England is countered by the number of self-emancipated people who fled their enslavers. For example, a Portsmouth, New Hampshire resident attempted to recover a 22-year-old man as early as 1715, and others continually self-emancipated throughout the colonial period. Free African American communities in the region served as beacons of freedom and from bondage, and captive people such as Venus and Jupiter, a couple who fled their enslavers in Dover, New Hampshire, presumably to live together in freedom, were able to secure their own emancipation by utilizing their connections to free persons of color. African Americans clustered together during the colonial period in New England. So, despite the relatively small numbers, most African Americans in the region lived in communities with other people of color. African American and mixed race communities in Maine began during the period of slavery and were often founded by the formerly enslaved. The communities were safe havens from the legal boundaries of their citizenship, as laws were passed beginning in the 17th century to limit Black behavior, relationships, citizenry, and movement. So, at the outset of the American Revolution, one thing that a lot of people don't know is the first person who is said to be the first casualty of the American Revolution was a Black seaman named Crispus Attucks. Attucks was likely of mixed Wampanoag and African descent, much like Amos Peters, who I'll speak of today, who freed himself from slavery in Framingham, Massachusetts, sometime around 1750. He was killed in a clash called the Bloody Massacre, or later the Boston Massacre, in Boston in 1770, which really begins the push towards what would eventually become the American Revolution a few years later. A lot of important things were happening during the American Revolution that led to the participation of African Americans in both sides of the conflict. For the British, a man named Lord Dunmore issued a proclamation in April 1775, and at the who he would at the time was Virginia's royal governor. He threatened to free enslaved people and reduce the capital, Williamsburg, to ashes if the colonists rebelled against British authority. In the months that followed, Dunmore's position became increasingly desperate. His truth his troop strength fell to just 300 men, and on June 8th, fearful of being attacked, he abandoned the governor's palace in Williamsburg, and fled to a British ship. On November 7th, 1775, he issued a proclamation that established martial law and offered freedom to enslaved people who would leave their patriotic owners to join the British Army. Quote, I do hereby further declare all indented servants, Negroes, or others appertaining to rebels free, that are able and willing to bear arms, they joining His Majesty's troops as soon as may be, for the more speedily reducing this colony to proper sense of their duty to His Majesty's crown and dignity. Within a month, 300 black men had signed up to Dunmore's Royal Ethiopian Regiment. While the regiment grew only to about 800 men, his proclamation inspired thousands of enslaved people to seek freedom behind British lines throughout the Revolutionary War. Um, on the American side, eventually George Washington did also follow suit. And you'll see in a second that despite this, more people, African American men, fought for the British than the Americans. But one of these patriotic groups was the Bucks of America, an all-black militia company that served in a quasi-military capacity in Massachusetts during the American Revolution. There's very little known about their service, but they were recognized at the end of the Revolutionary War and presented this incredible silk flag you see here on the left, that shows the pine tree with the buck and, of course, the stars. Um, so the American Revolution really becomes this important moment for African Americans in New England, in particular, of course, as we're talking about today, to find freedom and to make freedom. Two of these people were Amos and Sarah Peters. While Amos Peters arrived to Warren as a free man, Sarah arrived as an enslaved person. Local historian Cyrus Eaton wrote in the 1850s in a section called People of Color in his town history of Warren. Quote, the first colored person was brought to this town by Captain J. McIntyre, who this year purchased Sarah as a slave of one Captain Brown of Damariscotta, who brought her from Guinea. He gave $50 or $100 for her, but about a year after this purchase, all slaves in Massachusetts were declared free under the Constitution. Hearing a rumor of this, she gave the representative P. Pebbles $1 to ascertain its truth and claimed her freedom. This woman is believed to have sustained a good character and was early and long a member of the Baptist Church. She was married to Amos Peters, from whom those of that name are descended. Others of their race joined them from time to time till in 1823 they had formed a sufficient number to be set off in a separate school district. So you see here on the left is actually from the town church records for the Baptist Church, that notes Sarah Peters here on number 7 as having been one of the founders, about a dozen people who founded the Baptist Church, which, is pretty incredible considering it was an integrated church that she became a part of. Sarah, having been born in Guinea, was about 30 years old when she came to Warren as the captain of Captain Brown. And she certainly was living in town by the mid 1770s. James McIntyre, who was referenced previously, lived very nearby where Sarah and Amos would eventually settle at the southeastern end of South Pond. Sometime around 1780, she gave birth to a son named Paul Mink, whose father was likely a local wealthy white man, one of the largest landholders in the area, who was of German descent. And I'll just, as an aside, put it out here how remarkable it was that she gave her son this name, despite the fact that he did not presumably claim him as his son. Little is known about her early life in Warren, but by 1784, she had raised this dollar and hired the lawyer, his name was Patrick Pebbles, to ascertain whether slavery had been abolished in Massachusetts. Finding that it indeed had been, she successfully argued that she was free. By the end of 1784, she had married Amos Peters, and they had their first child together, Isaac Peters, who would go on to helm the family and the community expansion throughout the 19th century. Sarah, as matriarch, helped establish her family as important members of the larger community, and she was well respected. Um, Her life and the life of her large family was inextricably linked to the sea. Through shipbuilding, seafaring, fishing, and other related industries that connected to the burgeoning merchant economies of the 18th and 19th century in northern New England, the Peters family grew deep roots in coastal rural Maine. Their community, situated around a 150-acre parcel of land near South Pond in Warren, provided them with the ability to expand their family and was largely supported through industries related to the sea. Amos Peters was born in Plimpton, Massachusetts in about 1737. He was of mixed African and Native American Wampanoag ancestry. His original status, whether he was enslaved or free, is unknown. He enlisted in the Continental Army on May 4th, 1775. He served for just over 3 months in Captain John Bridgham's company, which was part of Colonel Theophilus Cotton's regiment, tough name, as a private. According to local folklore, Amos had part of his ear shot off during the course of his service. After his service, Amos returned to Plimpton and married a 20-year-old Wampanoag woman named Mercy Pennis on March 16th, 1776. This marriage had certainly ended, presumably, potentially with the death of Mercy. Um, but by 1780, Amos had moved to Warren to start a farm on a 150-acre parcel of land that he got in, quote, a general agreement with Henry Knox. And this is such a very unknown part of this story, what exactly that means. There was definitely a relationship between Henry Knox, and if you're not familiar with Henry Knox, he was the general of war in under Washington. Uh, what exactly the nature of that relationship was is mysterious. We do know that Amos did work at Henry Knox's home, Montpelier, in Thomaston. We don't really know doing what, and we don't know how they knew each other. So one of my theories is that Amos was actually at the same battle, the Battle of at Saratoga, New York. Amos was there, and it's possible that they knew each other through that because they were both there. However, it's obviously one of those big historical mysteries that we'll probably never figure out how did these two men know each other. This was not a land grant. So this was not part of the land granting that happened as compensation that a lot of Revolutionary War soldiers received. He is not officially recorded as a land grantee. So who knows what the nature of this relationship was. But certainly Amos had received this piece of land early and we have the first deed recorded January 9th, 1804, that records the fact that he already is in possession of this land. At this point, he is actually deeding this land, part of the land, to his stepson, essentially, Paul Mink. So by his death in 1821, he and Sarah had four sons who would each go on to start their own families, leading to the expansion of the Peterborough community in the early decades of the 19th century. They both utilized these political events to leverage better opportunities for himself. Um, so, uh, sorry. This land was critical, the land that they received from Knox was critical for the ability of the Peters family to expand in the 19th century. It provided accessibility to employment and plenty of arable land to plant crops and farm. It is situated around a small lake called South Pond and is bordered by the Back River, a small river that drains from South Pond. South Pond eventually connects to the St. George's River, providing access to the open ocean, which would have been critical for the mariners who lived in Peterborough. Their community depended upon the sea for transportation, to attract newcomers, and to work. In America as a whole, approximately 20,000 African Americans were engaged in some sort of shipping or seafaring employment in the early 19th century. This was hard work and meant time away from their families and home. Yet for people of color in New England, it could be difficult to come by, but it meant enough money to support themselves. In 1775, the fishing industry in New England employed over 4,000 men and shipped 42,000 tons of fish abroad. Black fishing, seafaring, and shipbuilding continued to grow as the merchant economy expanded in the late 19th century. The late 18th and 19th centuries. Maine's black sailor population expanded the greatest during the decade between 1840 and 1850. In Maine, circa 1840, approximately 7% of African Americans were involved in the maritime activities. The rest were involved in agriculture. By 1850, African Americans with maritime occupations had risen to 45%. So a huge jump in just a decade. Um, in 1850, Portland had an African American population of 395. Brunswick had 119, and Warren had 53. Other towns with sizable populations were Auburn, Augusta, Eastport, Gardner, and Machias. These towns were strategically located along waterways, providing agricultural and marine occupations for African Americans in the region. Sarah's arrival to town and her freedom and good standing within the community closely resembles the story of Elizabeth Freeman, also known as Mumbet. Mumbet was an enslaved woman who lived in Massachusetts. Her case was a landmark decision in Massachusetts, which led to the Commonwealth versus Jennison. Quock Walker's freedom, and Jennison was the enslaver of Quock Walker. Quock Walker's freedom was decided in this case, which ultimately led to the question of the legality of slavery with the new Massachusetts Constitution. Both of these people had been hearing all of this revolutionary talk about what is freedom, how can we be free in this under this oppressive monarchy, and all of these ideas about freedom, particularly in Mumbet's case, who she actually lived in the household of a rebel in Andover, Massachusetts. She was hearing all of this talk and seeing this hypocrisy that they're talking about freedom and, creating a free American republic, but meanwhile, thousands of people of African descent are enslaved. Um, so during this time period, they, like others, began to sue in what's called in Massachusetts freedom suits, which became common in the years just prior to and following the Revolutionary War, where at least 30 cases were heard in Massachusetts court. Brahman Bet versus Ashley, Mumbet's case, set a legal precedent in the Massachusetts court system. They argued that the entire system of slavery was illegal and that Brahman Bet were not the property of Ashley. Mumbet went on to become the free domestic laborer of the Sedgwicks, her lawyer's family. And so Sarah's case is very much following within this tradition that is being established in the state of Massachusetts, where African Americans are hearing about successful suits for freedom in the state and are taking up that opportunity to argue for their emancipation. Sarah had taken this initiative after this 1784 case, where Quock Walker essentially it overturned the system of slavery in Massachusetts, and of course Massachusetts becomes the first state in the Union that abolishes slavery. And so Sarah really is a person who establishes this idea of freedom, I think, for her family, as did her husband, Amos, that they are two true patriots who are fighting for freedom for themselves and for their children and their community. The American Revolution was a benchmark moment for freedom making for Black Mainers. Peterborough and other communities across Maine showed this huge growth in the early Republican era. And the Revolutionary War really secured freedom to establish communities, secured their freedom so that they could establish communities of their own away from the racism within broader communities, of white communities. These communities served as a beacon and a place of refuge for people who were self-emancipating or emigrating from other places to find and make their own freedom. One of the biggest ways in which they expressed their freedom here in Peterborough was the establishment of their school in 1823. By 1823, they had, enough students where they needed to be set off from the rest of the schools in town. They were definitely geographically separated from the rest of the white community, and the other nearest schoolhouse was quite a distance away for them. And so in that year, they between 1823 and 1845, most of the school was held in various homes in Peterborough. By 1845, the town actually that year had an excess alewife run. St. George's River, Warren had a significant alewife population, going back, was significantly important to Wabanaki people. There's a lot of shell middens and sites there that show how intensively that was fished by Native Americans. And it was continued to be fished during this time period. And the town used the excess money from the alewife run that year in order to pay for this building that you see here in this photograph. This photograph dates probably to the 1870s. It's the only one that we have of the schoolhouse that shows it full. We don't have anything earlier, unfortunately, but you can see that it is, of reasonable size. It's on granite blocks. It is set very well. And so the students at Peterborough at various times had different teachers that included members of their own communities. So elders in their community would often teach at the schoolhouse at various points. But we also see white teachers actually being sent in. You can see this photograph on the upper right that shows a white teacher named Clara Calderwood with her students in the late 19th century. Um, During this time period, we see a significant amount of influx from other people coming from other communities during the early 19th century, and that includes Bristol, as I was as Jody mentioned at the beginning of the talk. At least one woman named Violet McClary married the son of Jacob Peters. Jacob was the second boy after Isaac. He was born in 1787 and was a seaman. He married Rebecca Griffin, who was from Brunswick originally. She eventually, her brother was one of the founders actually of Malaga Island. Rebecca moved to town, and unfortunately, in 1834, they had a large family. In 1834, Jacob was imprisoned in Mobile, Alabama, because he was a free seaman of color. And while he was awaiting his free papers, he actually died in that prison of an illness. So Rebecca and her family moved back and forth to Brunswick, back to Peterborough, and different places at various points. But one of their children married a woman from Bristol named Violet McClary. Um, and in addition to their sons, Amos and Sarah's sons, uh, Sarah, of course, had her eldest son, Paul Mink, and they also he also had a large family of his own. So it really centered these early years of Peterborough, that first generation after Amos and Sarah married, were really essentially one large family. Throughout the 19th century, we begin to see a lot of movement into Peterborough from other Black communities in Maine, as well as farther afield. So there were people who were coming up from the South, from North Carolina, from other places, Philadelphia, various spots all over the United States, Eastern Seaboard mostly, as well as even a woman who came from as far away as British Guiana in the northern part of South America. So, it was a significant place that clearly other people of color saw as a place where they could find freedom and make freedom. Of the 46 people who have occupations that were recorded on the censuses from the year 1790 through 1870, 18 of them, or nearly 40%, were farmers or were engaged in agricultural labor. 9 of them were seamen. The seemingly small numbers of seamen given by the census does not show their importance. Most of those 9 men were heads of households, sometimes supporting upwards of 10 people. And that shows you just how important that particular job was for financial stability of this community and other communities like it. Those who were engaged in agricultural labor were often doing so as part of their family farm, working together to support the community. They grew mostly rye in the farm at Peterborough, farms at Peterborough. Um, Whilst women were obviously, for the most part, excluded from seafaring, they did engage in agricultural labor. 65-year-old Rebecca Griffin, having moved back after the death of her husband, was listed as a farm manager on the 1860 census. So, Rebecca really shows that, she in particular was, following this tradition of women who are really taking a lead here in this community and being important members of the Black community of Peterborough. Um, so other occupations also played a role in Peterborough. Cyrus Eaton noted the 1802 arrival of Jack Douglas, a free Black person from New London, Connecticut, who was a celebrated violinist and regularly regaled townspeople during Sunday services with his playing. He started a hattery with a white man named Holbrook Martin. After Martin relocated to Camden, Douglas partnered with Isaac Brakely of Poughkeepsie, New York, who eventually took over the business. Unlike Malaga Island, where the health of the community depended largely upon their ability to successfully fish and sell lobster, Peterborough was able to amass and support a large population due to their ability to feed themselves through these various jobs, either um, through the direct farming or through having these seafaring jobs and other jobs that were paying well. Um, so, in closing, I think that Peterborough really shows us that African Americans in the state of Maine during the American Revolution were really taking every opportunity to find and make freedom. They were, utilizing all of the resources at their disposal, whether that was the legal system, finding pathways to freedom like Sarah through the legal process, or through military service, likely what Amos did, at least that helped him secure the land that would become Peterborough. And this community really continued to have these legacies of freedom making and resistance throughout the time period in which they occupied Warren. This community, unfortunately, after the 1870s, really began to decline in numbers, so that by the 1950s, there were essentially no people from the Peters family left living on this land. A lot of what I attribute this to is, the decline in shipbuilding, wooden shipbuilding after the American Civil War in the town of Warren. Um, the decline of the health of the fish stock in the Gulf of Maine after the Civil War, as well as the exclusion of African Americans from industrial factory work, whether that was by policy or by practice. Certainly, there were not any members of this community who were able to gain work in the town's factories. And so that really limited their ability to continue to hold on to this land. And so over time, they had to sell and mortgage the land throughout the late 19th century and into the 20th century. So that unfortunately, nothing is really left of this community other than the cemetery. But we hope that will change. I'm really hopeful that we can, install some signage or something to commemorate the fact that these people were there, and continue to honor the memory of these people and to recognize that there are many people who live locally who are descendant of this community and deserve to have their ancestors honored. And that is all from me for now.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for questions. That was wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm seeing a lot of clap reactions. And Jody and I've got questions to share, but for those of you who do have questions who didn't ask them yet, go ahead and put those in the chat for us. See, the first question that came in was, given that the Royal Navy was not very active in Maine during the Revolution, in contrast to places such as New York and Rhode Island, how did Maine's Blacks find work with the Royal Navy? I think I got
Oh, I don't know the answer to that question. Bob might next week, so I would tune into Bob's talk. I don't know if there were any African Americans in Maine who were enlisted in the Royal Navy. I do know that, obviously, for the most part, what we have seen in Maine is predominantly, at least what I have found, is predominantly people who were in the Army, not so much the Navy. But I could be wrong about that. So I would definitely suggest seeing what Bob has to say about that question. Thank
Okay,
you.
thank
It's a
you.
really interesting question.
I am getting some questions in the chat. Some people are saying the chat is disabled, but I want you to know you should be able to still send questions directly to myself or to Jody.
I'm not sure I can see them, but I
Okay.
can. Shannon can share them with me.
Okay. All right. I think the question asker needs to choose who
Yeah,
to send it to.
yeah. I'm surprised
Yeah.
I haven't seen
Yeah.
any in the chat.
Yeah. I'm not sure what that setting is, but
Yeah, but we do have another question though that came in, and I
yeah,
think
go
people are
ahead.
interested in the sea angle.
Yeah, go right
This
ahead.
question is, did those Maine blacks who self-emancipated during the Revolution flee via the sea, or did most stay in the region? And what were the factors specific to Maine that caused blacks in the region to choose to flee or stay in the region?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question to answer. So, because we don't have documentary evidence that discusses much in the way of people's pathways to freedom and how they sought freedom, at least during this time period in the 18th century. We begin to have more of it during the 19th century. I'll use the example. Let me see if I can share my screen again. I will share a little bit about. Sorry, I gotta get back in here to the right slide. Um, yeah, so this document on the right is an account by John Tropp and Philip Hubbard on their capture of a young enslaved person named Boston who belonged to Captain Underwood. This actually took place, I should have explained this when I zoomed through. This happened in 1777, so right in the middle of the war. And essentially, Boston fled to an island off of Kennebunk. And so he was actually basically living out there and in kind of like a marshy area off of Kennebunk. And oddly enough, this it gives us a really interesting insight into what others may have done by fleeing to these islands or places on the kind of the fringes, difficult terrain and things like that that were very rural or hidden away from the rest of the you know state essentially. Um, I find it telling that Underwood hired two people as slave catchers to go find him, despite the fact that this is in the middle of the American Revolution. So it shows you both, number one, how persistent enslavers were on maintaining slavery during this time period, and of course throughout the period of slavery. And then also it shows you just how much these people wanted freedom, that this man was willing to kind of go out there and put himself physically at risk by being in this, area, and then also, by being potentially chased. He knew what was going to happen. He knew he could be potentially chased, hence why he went where he went. So I think, we don't have during the revolution, we this is one of the only things that we have in terms of documentary evidence that supports the fact that people were fleeing, perhaps in this case not by sea, but certainly through a a maritime area. Um, but it shows us that people were seeking pathways to freedom through any means necessary. So we don't know, there's not a lot of documentary evidence, even for the Underground Railroad in the 19th century, that has survived, that gives us even very many definitive answers on this question. It is an enduring mystery, and unless we find, somebody's diary who chronicles their self-emancipation story, we may never really fully know, but we can do a lot of informed guessing as to how people were seeking freedom. So, my guess, my answer to this question is yes, they were certainly, going through these maritime pathways to find freedom, but also probably staying in through the woods and establishing these communities kind of on Maine's hinterlands.
Shannon,
Jody,
you want to do the
do you
next
have the
one?
next one? You go ahead, Jody.
Okay.
Yep.
Um, Someone has asked, you showed a slide of Maine's African American communities, including one in Danville. I grew up in Auburn, which later encompassed Danville. Could you please talk about that Black community?
Well, I don't know a lot about Danville, but what I do know is, it was similar in its founding to Peterborough, that it was founded by, a small group of African Americans and persisted at least through the 19th century, before it was incorporated into other towns. Bob, again, has also done a lot of research on Danville, so he may be able to tell you a little bit more. And you may also want to check out the Prince Project to see what Vonna has recorded. But it was a significant African American community with a significant population during the 19th century. I think Anne Blair has her hand up.
See, we've got a couple hands up. It
Okay,
does become tricky. Why don't I, if you don't mind, I'll ask the questions that have come through the chat first
sure.
because it's a little easier to keep track of. And then we can go to hands up if there are people who can't type them in the chat. The next one, it's actually, I'm going to put a few questions together because a lot of people are asking, are there sites that we can visit? There is a question, there are two questions about cemeteries and one about whether there are any architectural remnants to visit, and really and then the third one is what is there now in Peterborough?
Okay. Well, to start, my friend Amanda Shelmerdine is on the call with us. Amanda is the sexton for the town of Warren, meaning she takes care of the cemeteries. And so she is stewarding the cemetery. Currently, the cemetery is the only extant physical remains of Peterborough. We do not believe that any buildings have survived. Perhaps they may have. It's a, with 150 years of building modification, it's really difficult to tell whether, something dates to this time period within this area. But essentially, the cemetery is the only place that you can visit. Obviously, this time of year is not the best time to visit. So I would suggest in the spring. And I know that Amanda has been doing an incredible job with ensuring that the cemetery is accessible as much as possible. It is just off of the Shore Road. If you look at you can Google the Peterborough Cemetery and it will come up and give you the Google directions on how to get there. It is, always something that I think uh, we are looking to hopefully expand our interpretation in the built environment, maybe through signs and things like that. But there's a lot of different moving parts to that work. Amanda, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you want to say anything about the cemetery work or anything, a call to action, if you need any help clearing poison ivy this year, feel free to speak up.
Well, I certainly appreciate the opportunity. We are doing, more and more research and adding more names to the roles of individuals that have been buried there but do not have headstones through historical documentation. There are the history there is just so rich and diverse, and the area in of itself has been built on by other houses. So while there are no other homes that you can visit, we are certainly hoping to expand our knowledge of the cemetery by adding, doing some ground penetrating radar to fully discern where everyone is buried there, as well as at some point to do some additional signage. So we would like to get it listed on the State of Maine's Historical Register and then on the National Registry as well.
Thanks, Amanda. Um, so, in short, I think it's an ever work in progress, and a lot of that depends on funding and support and things like that. So if you are interested in that, you can feel free to email me and I can connect you with Amanda if you'd like to help with anything with the cemetery.
Are there more questions, Shannon, or can we take a question from Annie Blair?
Yep, Anne has just will you maybe you could read the message that Jamie sent in. I still have a few questions here. I think I forwarded something to you. Jody, did you see that? It's long.
I think Anna's is gonna explode if we
Okay.
don't let
Yeah.
her unmute and ask her
So
question.
what I'm having a hard time with is that I have so many people here and it is difficult to manage the muting and unmuting. So I just ask everyone to be patient with me because a lot of people are trying to ask to unmute at the same time and we don't want things to get out of hand. But
Oh boy.
it's
Okay.
Annie Blair. I am able to unmute her at this time. Okay. Hopefully, Annie, you should get a note there. Did that work?
Yes, can you hear
Okay.
me?
Yes, thank you.
What does emancipation mean?
Self-emancipated. So we are moving away from, just in general in the field, moving away from the term escaped slave. In general, we are moving away from the term calling someone a slave because it removes their agency and their humanity as a historical actor from the past. So a self-emancipated person is someone who is escape, using this opportunity to remove themselves from slavery through using their own body to leave their in place of captivity.
Okay.
Oh, I think that Annie might have been back muted. Sorry, folks. This is just a setting that I chose to kind of keep things under control with so many people. I didn't mean to make it difficult. Annie, did you have a follow-up for that?
Yes. Does that mean that people could then be captured back into slavery?
It does. Yes. And people certainly were like this man Boston who I was just talking about. He was recaptured. This document is in the Maine State Archive, so you can actually go and read the transcription of it. But yes, people were recaptured into slavery and re-enslaved, throughout the period. This is obviously the period I'm talking about is well before the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which is what most people are thinking about when they think of slave catchers and things like that. But there were people who would be paid to go out and recapture self-emancipated people.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Carol has had her hand up for a while too, so if we're okay with that, we can move on to her and just give me a second. Carol, you should get a note indicating that you can unmute.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm
Sure.
interested in finding out, do you have any information about African Americans in China, Maine, particularly the family of Chandler Ross?
I don't. I've never researched China. But I would be happy, I'll give a little shout out to Atlantic Black Box. My colleague Meadow Dibble is on the call. Atlantic Black Box is a nonprofit organization whose mission it is to research and reinterpret slavery, the history of African Americans, slavery, Native Americans in New England, and bring that to light. And so we have a lot of uh, methods and toolkits for how you can do this research yourself. And also, we have a lot of connections to people who may be doing research in your community. So I would encourage you to visit atlanticblackbox.com. And you can email me and I can try to do some brief digging or connect you with someone who may be able to help you.
Okay, what's your email address?
I will give it to Shannon and she can send it out to everybody with the recording if that works
Right.
for you.
Yeah, so I'll send a follow-up to everybody in a couple of days.
There's a significant number of people in my family who traveled between Stoughton, Avon, Massachusetts area to China, and they went back and forth, and a number of them were born in China. So we were always wondering what was it about China, Maine, that so
Mhm.
many people in our family were migrating back and forth.
Mm. Wow, that's interesting. Would love to chat more offline.
Okay,
Okay.
great.
Yeah,
Thank
I'll
you.
look forward to getting your email address.
Thank you, Carol. I'm going to
Thank
pop you
you.
back on mute and I saw a couple other hands come up.
I can see one. I see Matthew Fountain's hand is up.
Looks like he's next. Matthew, you should get a note indicating that you can come off mute.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I was just going to say this is an excellent lecture. Um, I wanted to know in a paragraph or less, what was the connection between the Wabanaki uh, tribe and the African Americans coming over here um, in these different circumstances? I'm just a little confused about that. Um, but you've got, Native Americans, and then you've got this relationship between them and these either freed blacks or enslaved, you know, blacks from Africa, and those moving parts. That's all. It's kind of a complicated question. I'm sorry,
It
but
is. I don't know if
I
I
was
can
just
answer it
asking.
well in a paragraph,
That's okay.
but I will
I
try.
know. Okay.
Certainly there is, through these circumstances of oppression, I would say, African Americans and Native American people were, often together in both geography and then also through these various circumstances, particularly during the colonial period and leading up to the Revolutionary War. They're often living in the same spaces and sort of living within the same sort of colonial frameworks. So, you know, African Americans, they are often intermarrying with indigenous people, and that is, we see that across what would become the United States, that there is a real kinship between, in many cases, between African American people and indigenous people in the United States. So, in the case of the Wampanoag tribe, which is in Massachusetts, which is where Amos Peters was from, there certainly were a number of people who were descended of African and Wampanoag people. So, what exactly does that mean in a bigger context? I don't know if anybody's done a serious study to look at, how many relationships there were like this, how many people were moving in and out of these communities, but certainly it was significant to both groups that they had a lot in common and were able to come together in these various ways and, look for ways around this oppressive colonization and racism and things like that.
Well, I appreciate that. That answers my question. That both of those groups probably collaborated together uh, because they were in a heck of a situation. And thank you for your answer.
Yeah, thank you.
That's all I got. You're welcome.
Shannon, do you want me to share this information
Yeah.
from Jamie?
Yeah, and Kate, I know that you know Jamie, so Jamie sent in something that he thought might help with
Is
a
Jamie still on the call? Maybe Jamie can do it.
I think so, Jamie. Yeah, you keep asking me to unmute people. This is hard work.
You got to go through the whole list.
Jamie, if you're there, I'm going to ask you to unmute, and if you are not, then we'll see what
Yep,
happens.
I see him.
There we
I
go.
see him.
Hi.
There we go.
He's there. This is my
Hi.
board president, Jamie Tanzer.
Hi, everybody. This was just in reference to the Royal Navy and opportunities for the enslaved to run away or to self-emancipate to the Royal Navy. And I'm looking at this awesome book, which I'm sure Kate knows. It's called Escaping Bondage. It's by Antonio Bly. And it contains probably thousands of runaway advertisements for enslaved people. And there's actually one from 1777 in October from James McCobb. It was posted in a New Hampshire paper. And those of us who are from this area on the Kennebec know the name James McCobb. And he lived in Georgetown at the time, which was actually Phippsburg, today's Phippsburg. And he writes that two of the men that he enslaved, whose names were Cato and Jack, had self-emancipated. And he gives a very in-depth description of how each of them looked and what they were wearing. And at the end of it, he says, P.S. He actually says, P.S. It is thought that they will try to get to the British troops. All masters of vessels are cautioned from carrying them off. And at the time, in 1777, there were British Navy troops going up and down just outside of the mouth of the Kennebec River. So it would have been really easy for these two men to just float on down the river, to grab a dinghy and just head out there to the mouth of the river and join the Royal Navy. I'm not sure if they were ever brought back to James McCobb, but this just sort of goes to show that people knew, James McCobb knew anyway, that this was a real possibility, that the men he enslaved could have gotten to the Royal Navy and indeed might have wanted to get to the Royal Navy. Thanks.
Thank you, James. That's really interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. Okay, I've got another question. This one's a quick and easy one, I think, Dr. McMahon, but I thought important in case others missed it. But we had somebody who missed the significance of the Amos's ear, and I know that you did bring that up, but I wondered if you could kind of
Sure.
revisit that
So
briefly.
Amos, when he enlisted in 1775, actually had, at least according to folklore and to oral histories that are, have survived in Warren, he had his ear shot off. So he was missing his ear and was presumably deaf in that ear. And that's something that gets kind of repeated throughout his life. He lived to be in his 90s, and so he was a longstanding member of the community in Peterborough, and so he had his ear shut off. He did actually re-enlist in 1776 after his marriage to Mercy Pennes and was a spy in Newport, Rhode Island. So, which is really interesting. He essentially, I think probably was chosen to be a spy because as a black person in a slave port, which Newport, Rhode Island was, he was likely able to move around in ways and be just, like Harriet Tubman did during the Civil War. She's not looked at as potentially someone who could be spying. So, he eventually, he's out of the army less than a year later, and ends up coming to Warren by 1780. So yes, his ear was shot off, which, lucky him that it didn't go any closer to his head. So.
Thank you for revisiting that. That's quite a story. Next question in the chat, and I know I've got a couple of hands raised as well, so we'll try to get to as many as we can. Did the Minks live in Peterborough? Is there any information on the connection or clues as to how Sarah became mother to Paul? I know you started to talk about that, but this is from Lisa, who says she's a descendant of Paul and Sarah.
Oh, well, wonderful. Yes. So I don't know how those two got to know each other. I have my gut feeling about it is that it was not a fully consensual relationship. Certainly, in general, an enslaved person was unable to fully consent when it came to a sexual relationship with a white person. Paul was in and out of the town of Warren. He mostly, I believe, lived in Waldoboro, and that was where most of his land was, but he plays a part in the town of Warren in its creation. So what exactly the nature of their relationship was is a mystery. He definitely didn't claim Paul as his son because Amos basically adopts Paul. Paul was, a young boy when Amos and Sarah met, and raises Paul with Sarah. And eventually, that deed that I showed, he actually deeds over the vast majority of the land to Paul before, as he was becoming an older man in 1804. Amos didn't die for another decade, but, presumably thought Paul as a, very responsible person enough to take care of the family's land. And, there are a lot of mink descendants out there, so I would love to connect you to other Paul mink descendants that I know. So feel free to email me for sure, and you can trade information with them. It's another one of these mysteries as to how Sarah met him and what the context of that relationship was. It's just unknown, because we don't have anything directly that either party, we don't know what their perspectives were on any of this, Sarah or Amos.
Thank you. Jody, did you see which hand went up next by any chance? We've got a couple of hands up.
I'm guessing it was probably Carol and Anthony.
All right, Carolyn, let's see if we can get you off mute.
Okay, I'm unmuted. This is
Yes.
Carolyn. Hi.
Hi.
This is kind of a related question. I'm not sure if it's quite your area, but I was reading a history of Leeds, Maine, which is where some of my family comes from, and was very surprised to see this sentence. In 1676, 350 innocent confiding Indians on the Maine coast were enticed on board of vessels, made captives, shipped to Boston, and sold into foreign slavery. And I guess I was not aware of this idea of us putting Indians into slavery and sending them out of the country. Is that something you know anything about?
I know a little bit about it. I am definitely not an expert about it, but during King Philip's War and directly following a number of other conflicts between the English colonizers and Wabanaki people in the state of Maine and Massachusetts, there were a significant number of Wabanaki people who were enslaved as a direct punishment for their resistance to colonization and brought to plantations in the Caribbean. Meadow is on the call. Meadow, what is the name of that book? Meadow, are you still here?
Let's see if I can get Meadow. Bring her into the conversation.
Do you know the name of the book I'm thinking of? It's like Bondage something. I'll try to think of if Meadow can't be unmuted.
No, it looks like she's here.
Hi, Meadow.
Hey, Kate.
You know the name of the
So,
book I'm thinking of?
say again, say more.
About the book about indigenous enslavement during the
So actually there's a forthcoming book by Linford Fisher of Brown University, called Stolen America, or Stealing America, I believe. The companion website is Stolen Relations, related. So this is focused on indigenous enslavement. There's another major scholar of indigenous enslavement in the U.S., whose work is actually, the title is escaping me right now. But I was actually trying to send a message right at this moment to say, to ask that, yes, the person who asked that question, if you could please share the reference that you just cited, if you could email that to meadow@atlanticblackbox.com. I'd love to talk with you, and we'll be sure to get you the references that Kate and I are thinking of.
Okay, will do.
For those who don't
Thank
know,
you.
Meadow is the executive director of Atlantic Black Box.
Thank you, Carolyn. Kate, there's one more hand up and no more questions waiting in the chat. So this may be our last one. Let's bring Richard into the conversation. Richard Perkins, are you able to unmute yourself? There we go.
Hello.
Hi.
I have a question for Dr. McMahon. What have you found about the African American participation at Lexington and Concord, or the Culpeper Battalion against the British in Hampton, Virginia before the Declaration?
I'm not a military historian, so I have not really done any research about, specifically the African American participation in the broader battles of the American Revolution. I've mostly been focused on Maine and specifically the community of Warren. However, there are a number of good books. If you go to Atlantic Black Box's website, you can find, we have a books page for readings, and you can find some really great books on African Americans in the American Revolution. Unfortunately, it's just not an area that I've done a significant amount of research. I do believe the African American Museum in Boston is another great resource, and then the African American the National Park Service has a lot of resources about African American participation in the American Revolution through their sites in Boston and the areas around there.
Okay, thanks for the answer.
Great.
We did have someone really quickly just jump in and say a book about Indigenous and African enslavement that you might look at is New England Bound by Wendy Warren.
That's the one I was thinking of. Thank you.
Okay. Good, thank you. Okay. Go ahead, Jody.
So we know that Kate has a young child at home who this is beyond bedtime for. So I think we need to wrap this up. But wow, Kate, thank you so much for spending so much time with us tonight and sharing all of this terrific research you've done. What a fascinating topic. Thank you to everyone for being here tonight. Thank you to Shannon for hosting. That's always such a challenge. Much appreciated.
It was an absolute delight. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, everyone who was here. We had 78 people stay in until the very end, and we were well over 100 at one point. So this was a real success.